Good afternoon. I'm Rob Bertini. I'm the Director of the Center for Transportation Studies, and on behalf of my colleague Jennifer Dill from Urban Studies and Planning, I want to welcome you to our final seminar for the Winter 2004 series. And we're very pleased to have Brian Gregor here from ODOT, and he's going to be talking about the economics of congestion. And I have a couple housekeeping items. When you ask questions, please remember to press and hold the button on the microphone in front of you. I'm going to pass around the sign-in sheet. I just want to remind the registered students that the written assignments are due on Tuesday by 5 p.m. Jennifer or my mailbox will be fine. And so just to remind you, it's either a reflective journal or a paper, so we really need those by Tuesday. And Morgan is passing out the course evaluations for the students in the USP 407, 507, so he'll be collecting those at the end. And we do appreciate your comments, and we look forward to seeing you again in a few weeks during the spring term. So I'm going to turn it over to Brian.
Okay. Thanks, Rob. My topic title is the economics of congestion. And here you need to think of congestion as there's the travel demand, so it's the economics of the travel demand, and there's the supply. Actually, there's very little to do with congestion pricing in my talk. So if I hope you're not disappointed. And more to do with some of the fundamental drivers of travel and travel growth, and then how that relates to congestion, and then some of the measures of congestion. And this presentation is a result or comes from a report that I just completed, a statewide congestion overview. It's published on our website, and I'll give you the URL for getting that later. And as I worked on this overview, it became apparent to me that I think people don't pay enough attention to some of the fundamental economic underpinnings when they look at travel trends and look at congestion. And really, economic considerations are pretty central to people's lives. You can see here the business cycles tracked by unemployment in Oregon and the nation. And there's not a lot that's more fundamental than a job to you're managing your lives and your households. So that sort of thing needs to be paid attention to when you're looking at travel. But I think that economic considerations have often been overlooked in the development of transportation policy. And here's an example in this chart. What it shows are 10-year averages of the rate of increase of VMT per capita. So each bar represents the average over a 10-year period. And then the dashed line is the 30-year average rate of increase. Now, back in the early 90s, when a lot of policy was being developed, like the Oregon Transportation Plan, the Transportation Planning Rule, at the national level, ICE-T, people were looking back at that 80 to 90 period and saying, oh my, VMT per capita is just growing at this fantastic rate. We've got a big problem. But if you look at that rate, and the yellow arrow points out what people were paying attention to, it was abnormally high for that 30-year period. And surprisingly, not much of the writing about the growth of that, of VMT per capita at that time, mentioned or thought about the fact that in the beginning of that period, we were in a very bad recession. In the end of the period, we were out of the recession. And so you had this big growth of VMT per capita that was due in significant part to the growth of the economy. And if you look at associations between economic indicators and travel, they're pretty strong. Here is a graph showing statewide vehicle miles traveled per $1,000 of total state personal income. So for each year, divide the total VMT by the total personal income, control for inflation. So this is all in real dollars. And you see, gee, that's a pretty flat line. It only varies from the average of that line by about plus or minus 8%. I was floored when I saw this trend. And you can see that the year-to-year changes in VMT tend to track the year-to-year changes in total personal income. Personal income goes up, VMT goes up, personal income goes down, VMT goes down. Now, the difference between these two curves, I think, may have to do with not gas tax, but fuel prices. And in periods where the fuel prices were high and vehicles were inefficient, you tended to have higher incomes growth relative to VMT growth. And after fuel prices started falling and vehicles were more efficient, you had more VMT growth compared to personal income growth. Now, I think it's you get this connection between the economy and travel at a pretty fundamental level, and it goes back to David Ricardo's principle of comparative advantage. And I don't know if you cover that in your courses, but it's a pretty important principle for looking at travel and the reasons for travel. But fundamentally, comparative advantage, if you haven't been exposed to that concept, is that if two or more people differ in their relative price or relative prices for producing different goods, that they are better off by producing those goods that they can produce at a lower relative price and trade for those goods that they would produce at a relatively higher price. And it's not a matter of absolute advantage. You don't have to have an absolute advantage. You just have to have a comparative advantage. And so this material benefits of comparative advantage really encourage people to specialize, and you're all going to school to specialize rather than to do a real general activity. Because if you specialize and then trade for the things you're not producing, then you're better off materially than if you don't specialize. And so specialization and trade work together. But if you're going to trade, you need transportation and communications. And that transportation and communications determines how big your market is. If the transportation's costly, then it doesn't pay to trade, and it doesn't pay to specialize. Then, as well, transportation and communication has there's a land use component to this. Activity clustering occurs in cities. Cities occur because of comparative advantage. Cities occur largely because by clustering, the costs of transportation go down. And so that's one way to harness the advantages of comparative advantage. Transportation improvements help to lower the costs of trade, and they push cities out, and you have that dynamic. Now, I contend there have been a number of structural changes in the economy which have increased the amount of specialization in trade. And those have simultaneously then increased economic growth and increased travel in our country. And I'll go through this diagram on the right, which links everything together, flowing from basically an increase in work. We had baby boomers entering the workplace. We had increased labor force participation of women. We had increased hours of work. And basically what we had in our economy was a transfer of time from the unspecialized household economy. You know, when baby boomers like me were kids, we weren't working. My time, as I grew older, my time went into the paid economy. Right. As women participated more, their time went into the paid economy. Less time, unspecialized household time, more specialized paid time. That's comparative advantage. The economy grew. And so I'll go through the parts of this and just give some interesting facts and observations about things that have changed and how it all feeds into increased vehicle travel. Between 1970 and 2001, we had a doubling of workers, although the population increased by 65%. Between 75 and 2001, population of 16 and older increased from 72 to 76%. Percent of women in the labor force increased from 48 to 62%. And from 1973 to 2001, average weekly hours worked increased from 41 to 50. Now that's a national average. I don't have the Oregon numbers on that. And there's, I think, some other parts behind this. When I first was looking at these relationships, it seemed to me that what we had was more workers, and therefore we'd have higher household incomes because you had more workers per household, and you'd have more consumption and more travel. But what happened wasn't an evenly distributed across the working population. Average annual wages actually stagnated over that time, as you can see in this graph. From 70 to 2001, there's really not much change in average annual wages in real dollars. And those wages weren't distributed equally among all sectors of the population. Here you see in a chart I took out of Kevin Phillips's Wealth and Democracy. It shows the percent change in income by quintile. And I've drawn a red box around the 4 bars on the right to highlight that those are the top, together are the top quintile. So you can see in the bottom 3 quintiles there was a loss in income. The 4th quintile had a small gain. Most of the gain was in the top quintile, and most of the gain in the top quintile was in the top few percent of income. So for a lot of families, their income stagnated. Even though they were working more hours and more people in the family were working, their income stagnated. And this is the median income, family income for 4-person families in Oregon in year $2,000. So you had more people working, and that meant they were commuting more, and they were traveling more. And many of those people probably had to work more just to maintain their standard of living. And I think that has important implications we'll get back to later on when you're developing transportation policies and assessing them. It highlights to me the importance of looking at the effect of those policies on different parts of our society. We can't just look at averages. Now, the shift of household time to paid labor meant that there was less time available for household activities. And And so you see, for example, between 1969 and 1987, nationally, it was estimated that the average annual hours spent by women on household work declined by 249 hours. Now, the average annual hours spent by men increased, but it didn't counteract the decline. So basically, household time has declined. So households were producing goods and services for their families. What are they to do if they aren't producing those goods and services anymore? Well, they have to buy the goods and services that they no longer produce. So this is comparative advantage. You work, specialize in something, you buy from someone else what you don't produce as a generalist. And so, for example, between 1977 and 1992, the number of paid child care workers in the nation increased from 190,000 to 468,000, so more than doubling. You had increase in the proportion of household food expenditures spent on eating out, 26 to 38%. Shopping trips increased from 29% to 44% of all trips. Consumption per capita in real dollars doubled between 1970 and 2000. And if you look at VMT, so all of this were a trip that's consuming something, or if you consume something, you're going to have a trip somewhere along the chain, unless you're going on the internet and buying software online, and a product there is transmitted via a wire. But otherwise, you buy something, it's going to be a trip, but whether it's a service or a good. And you can see that in that truck VMT in the state between 80 and 2002 doubled, whereas light vehicle VMT increased by 78%. The increase in work, I think, also had an effect on vehicle ownership. Vehicle ownership may have increased anyway, but it does. Owning a vehicle, it helps a household to economize on travel time, and this would increase encourage additional vehicle ownership. So, as an example of the advantages of owning a vehicle, on average, people who commute by private vehicles spend half the time of people who commute by public transportation. And in Oregon, the number of vehicles per driving age person increased by 18% since 1975. And when people own vehicles, they tend to use them, so vehicle ownership tends to go along with increased vehicle use. But another thing happened as a result of reduced household time and the vehicle ownership is that you have increased trip chaining. Households were under pressure. You know, they had to get to work. They had to get these services that they didn't have to purchase before, and you only have so much time in the day. So when you're coming back from work, you stop at the grocery store, or you make some other stop. You stop at the restaurant and get takeout and bring it home. You chain trips together, and that helps people save time. And there was a big increase in trip chaining, and people were looking at, well, why do we have this increase in additional trip making during the peak hours? Well, you had additional trip making in the peak hours because people were chaining other trips to their work trips. And women in particular chain work and non-work trips. In Oregon, according to our travel surveys, about 20 to 30% of work trips are chained. Now, the chaining of work trips had an effect on the competitiveness of ride sharing and public transportation. because it's difficult if you're chaining, harder if you're chaining trips to do it in that way. You don't go home in your carpool and say, does everybody want to stop at Safeway and do some grocery shopping before we go on? And so we saw big decreases in the percentage of commuters who ride share. That declined in Oregon from 17.6 to 12.6. Nationally, the biggest declines in carpooling came from the reduction of the large car pools, and commuter carpools were increasingly composed of workers from the same household. So it was household carpools. Of course, if you decrease the proportion of riders of transit or shared ride, you're going to increase the vehicles on the roadway. So the increase, to sum that up again, what we had is this large increase of work in our society and a shift, more importantly, a shift out of the household economy into the paid economy, and that increased specialization in trade, and that had a chained effect on the amount of vehicle travel. So as the economy grew, travel grew, and they had the same cause. Now, sprawl, and another alternative explanation for increased travel is that sprawl of cities cause travel to occur, and induced travel. Then in induced travel, I don't know if you've come across that that phrase before or the concept before, but basically induced travel means that the amount of travel on the system responds to the size of the system. Or so if you build a new road and you reduce travel time, you'll get more people traveling on the road. And economically, it's basically that if you reduce the price of transportation, then people will consume more transportation, just like any other good. And you can, thinking back to the earlier slide that I had on the connections of trade and specialization in transportation, you can see that would also say that there is induced travel. If you reduce the cost of transportation, you make trade more possible. You make then specialization more possible, and more travel occurs. Now, I think the consensus among researchers is that induced travel is a real phenomenon. Theory supports it. There's various research that supports it. But there's not a lot of consensus about what the magnitudes are, the sensitivities. And that gets to some of the real difficulties of doing that kind of research. We don't, as far as I'm aware, have any examples of research on induced travel in Oregon. But what I've attempted to do is look at the basic model for induced travel and look at some of the data coming out of Texas Transportation Institute's Urban Mobility Study and see whether the direction of changes in relevant variables in Portland are consistent with what an induced travel explanation of VMT increase would pose. So on the left you see the basic model that you build more highways, you get higher speeds, things sprawl out more, and because you have higher speeds and more sprawl, you get more trips and longer trips. So the question is, did we have higher speeds, and did we have more sprawl? And the graph shows the trends in VMT in the black line, which there shows VMT increased quite a bit in the Portland area. Population, which increased, but not nearly as fast as VMT. In other words, VMT per capita went up. The size of the urbanized area, which is shown in red, and then index of sprawl, which is basically the ratio of size of the area to population. So if things are sprawling, the acres per capita should be going up over time. And then speed. And the speed data comes from the Texas Transportation Institute's estimates of system speed. And what we see is that sprawl decreased. In other words, the urbanized area became denser over time since the 1982, and we see that speeds decreased. And so looking at the model on the left, we didn't have higher speeds and we didn't have more sprawl, yet we had an increase in VMT. Now, that's not to say that sprawl doesn't have an effect on the amount of VMT, or that speeds don't have an effect on VMT. And I'll show something later, which I think may be evidence that the containment of growth in the Portland growth boundary helps to limit the effect of congestion on travel time in the area. So I'm not saying that those things don't affect VMT. It's just that those things didn't occur, yet VMT grew. So VMT was growing because of the fundamental economic changes, not because of these things. You may have had even less VMT growth if you had even more containment or slower speeds, but those things didn't cause the rise of VMT. I think you're...
Did you look at this at all compared to other states?
No, I didn't. I think that'd be fascinating for you to do. Yeah.
I'm a little bit just confused on the words higher speeds. Does that mean like in the area the roads used to be 35 miles an hour and now the roads are 55 because we built a highway? Or does that mean smoother traffic flow? What does higher speeds really mean? Is it smoother flow or is it just higher posted speeds?
It would be higher actual speeds, so operating speeds. And the Texas Transportation Institute estimates speeds during the peak period, and so that's what these reflect. Now, at the same time that the economy of the state and travel grew, the proportion of the economy that was invested in highways declined. And that's what this graph shows, that during the 60s, you had about 2.5% of total statewide personal income was invested in highway capital. That then, as this shows, declined, so that by the 90s, you had about a third of that amount invested in highway capital. So what was happening during that period is we had a bunch of surplus capacity built in the 50s, 60s, early 70s, and then we lived off that. Our reinvestment in that declined, and we were living off of it and using it up. And so it shouldn't be surprising that congestion grew. Travel was growing because of fundamental structural changes in the economy, and personal incomes were growing total in the state, but we invested less and less back in the system. And so when demand grew faster than supply, you got more crowding on the roadways. And basically congestion is crowding on the roadways. It's just more people competing for the space out there. And you can see here the average daily traffic per lane for different parts of the state highway system. The upper two lines show your interstate freeways and your other freeways and expressways, and you can see that the traffic loads on those almost doubled. Yeah.
Was there a variation, amongst different parts of the state when you were looking into this trend?
In terms of the growth, yes.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, certainly the highest congestion levels are in the Portland area. If you're looking at the traffic loads on the highway, you have. Is that answering your question, or?
Yes, it does. But can you go to the previous slide, please? And here, what these figures, these are percentages, but what were the figures in actual dollars, and then where the dollars were invested?
Okay, I don't have that. Yeah, I don't have. I didn't explore how much is being invested in different parts of the state. Yeah, Ken.
Brian, could you go back one more? Now, highway supply is not being measured here, and I would suspect it would be somewhere around the red line in terms of size. Is that what that's measuring, highway supply? And
right, I don't show lane miles on that graph, supply in lane miles. And lane miles did grow. So over this period, we did add lane miles to the major road system in the Portland area.
but not as rapidly as the population grew. So the lane miles per capita presumably would go down.
I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure. I don't recall it, and so I couldn't say that lane miles per capita went down. Now I want to shift into looking at how do we measure congestion and how you think about congestion. And I think it's how you think of it depends a lot on how you measure it. And the data from the urban mobility study offers a lot of opportunity to look at congestion measures and relationships. Even though it's fairly general data, it comes from HPMS data, it still is a really good data source to explore some of these relationships. And I'll go through a series of slides that compare Portland-Vancouver area measures with other similarly sized urbanized areas. And these are all cities that or areas that have populations of from 1 to 3 million people. I'll start off by looking at this amount of demand for the space. So if we take the peak period vehicles per lane. Now what the urban mobility study is they look at the major road system, which is basically your principal arterials. It's your freeways, expressways, and other principal arterials. And if you look at the peak period vehicles per lane, and the peak period that the urban mobility study looks at is not your peak hour or your morning peak hour and your evening peak hour. It's the period in which there's some decrease in travel speeds below free flow. And so it's a fairly broad, like about 3 hours in the morning and 3 hours in the afternoon. And what I show in this graph are the trajectories from 1982 to 2001 of all the urban areas in the study that are in this large category. And most of them are shown as the gray lines. Then in color are highlighted some of the western cities. So you can compare them against Portland. And Portland is the line in red. And then there's the dashed black line, and that shows the average for all the cities. And you can see there then that the Portland area started out at about the average in 1982 and then grew faster than average so that it was in the top tier of large cities in terms of the number of vehicles compared to the major road supply. And as you're probably aware, that the effect of congestion on speed is nonlinear. So as you get closer to the capacity of a roadway, the speeds drop faster and faster until you get to breakdown, in which speeds are just chaotic. And you can see then that in this chart, which shows the inverse of speeds, it's the travel rate. And it's called the TTI, or the Texas Transportation Institute calls it a travel time index. It's the amount of time that it takes in the peak period to drive, or how much more time it takes in the peak period to drive than in the off-peak. So a travel time index of 1.4 means that it takes 40% longer in the peak period to travel a mile than it does in the off-peak period. And the travel time index includes both your recurring delay, so your everyday delay, as well as the incident-related delay. So you can see that Portland started at below the average in the 80s and then grew much faster than the average and came out very high by 2001. Yes.
Looking at some of the other communities, it appears that they added supply, like San Jose. Is that dip related to added supply?
Yeah.
And what's going on there in Seattle? Did they slow growth, or what would you surmise from that leveling off?
I don't really know. I think it'd be, I'd like to have the time, or it'd be great if someone else would follow up and say what's happening in these cities, do case studies, and to look at that.
Seattle added a lot of capacity in terms of HOV lanes in the 90s.
Okay, thanks, Ken. But it's interesting, although speeds declined much more in Portland than average, that's not reflected in the delay. If you look at add up the delays, total delay, and divide by the number of people, the delay, annual hours of delay per peak period traveler did end up higher than average, but it doesn't, it's much closer to the average for Portland than you would think based on the speed numbers. And why is that? Well, I think, at least in part, it has to do with how far people travel. And your trip time is going to be a function of how fast you travel and how far you travel. And you can see that in the Portland area, it's the trips, daily miles per peak period traveler started out lower than the average. It grew and then declined so that it ended up below the average. And whereas some of these other comparative cities are higher than average. And it's one thing to think about when you probably saw the articles after the urban mobility study came out and said Portland is more congested than Seattle. And they were using those speed numbers or the travel time index number to make that statement. But it doesn't take into consideration that, as this chart shows, the Seattle trip is longer. So they're going to incur more delay for their trip than in the Portland area where the trips are shorter. And I believe this would have something to do with the Portland area urban containment policies. I haven't studied that to verify that. Another good project for you. But I think it makes sense that would, by containing growth, you would have activities located closer to each other, and so your trips would be shorter, and you could that would help counteract congestion effects on speed. And furthermore, if we look at the total travel time, then that grew even less than the delay. And you can see that the Portland area was really well below average in the annual hours traveled per peak period traveler. And it ended up at pretty much the place. Well, a little bit higher than it did at the start, but relative to the average for all urban areas, it stayed in about the same position. So then finally, if you look at this with some economic measures, and you take the value of that travel time, and you compare that, or maybe I should call it the cost of that travel time, and you compare it to the size of the Portland economy, so in total personal income, and you adjust, of course, for inflation, so you're in real dollars. And then to compare different urban areas, you adjust for different cost of living. And when you do that, you get this graph, which is the ratio of dollars, the cost of travel, to dollar of personal income for the region. And you see that although there was a decline in the early 80s and then a growth again in the latter 80s and very early 90s, after that it flattened out, and where it ended up was about where it started. So it costs the same through this, this period of about 20 years. It ended up costing the same amount to travel relative to how much production the region was doing over this period of time, despite big increases in congestion, big decreases in travel speeds. So another economic connection showing a very close relationship between the economy and travel. And it makes sense to me, thinking back to that earlier diagram, and I'll page back to that. If your transportation and communication costs are going to go up, you also have an effect on that will tend to reduce your market size, but then you have an effect on activity clustering. People are going to want to respond to that. They don't want to just pay more costs. So they'll make some decisions about where they locate and in order to offset that increase in cost so they can continue to get those benefits out of specialization and trade that they were getting. That's my hypothesis. Another good research project. And what's also interesting in this chart is that for so many of the urban areas in the same size, they had similar trajectories. That the ratio of travel costs to total income for the region didn't change much. Another interesting thing I want to point out there, you can see San Jose going back here, having this growth and delay. Then there was the addition of capacity, and that dropped off. But then it started growing again. But when you look at the economy, it doesn't show that cost going up again. And I believe what was happening there is that later period was the internet, growth boom, and so they're making a lot of money. And so the denominator was going up, and it kept the ratio down. So I'd like to now just go through several implications and then open it up to questions. And I think the first implication is that travel in the future is likely to grow as the state's economy grows. The connection there over time, it's a long period of time to have that kind of relationship. But the nature of economic growth might change. On average, every new job in Oregon added about 15,500 vehicle miles annually to the road system. Every $1,000 increase in total state personal income added about 360 vehicle miles traveled annually. And so I think we can expect as the economy grows in the future, we're going to see similar growth of VMT. But how the economy grows may be different, because I don't see that the social and economic changes that occurred over the past decades that resulted in the economic growth, the shift of time from the household time into paid labor, is going to continue to the same degree in the future. For example, there's been little change in the female labor force participation rate since 1993. So I think it's an interesting question. How is the economy going to grow? What's going to grow the economy? And maybe that's really a key to part of any analysis in saying, well, what problems will we have in the future? Actually, we don't, transportation professionals don't tend to, I think, look enough or do sensitivity testing to different economic futures. And I think it's an important thing to do. And the second implication is that congestion will get worse if economic growth continues to greatly exceed capital investment in the road system. As I said before, to a large extent, the mobility and accessibility that Oregonians have enjoyed over the past several decades is a result of the highway investments made decades ago. And we're using that up. And so when you use up the capacity, you don't replace it, well, congestion is going to grow. The third implication is that since congestion is going to get worse, it's important to recognize how people cope and to take actions to improve their ability to cope. think a lot of the reasons for people, let me back up, say it a different way, that I think that the public, through their own actions, has done more, every individual has done more through their own actions to blunt the effect of congestion than the public together through our government. And people have done that by chaining trips, or they've done it by their choice in locations of where they live, or they've done it by choosing where they work. But they've done a variety of things, or they've shifted when they go to work. They've taken advantage of flexible working hours. But they've done all those things to blunt the effect of congestion on them. And it's important that we have an idea of what are those things that people are doing to reduce the effect of congestion on them. And a lot of that has to do with them having choices that enable them to respond. And if we fail to recognize these things that people do, and we make a system more rigid that doesn't allow these choices, then you could end up making things worse for them. And as an example, say that you have a program to institute parking charges in order to get people out of their cars and onto the bus. Well, for, say, those people who are depending on trip chaining, they have to drop their kid off at daycare before going to work, and they have to, do some errands on the way home from work. If now they have got to pay this cost, you made things worse off for them. Maybe congestion has been improved, but this group of people have not seen an improvement in their lives. And so what it means is we really do need to look at different market segments and be able to analyze how policies would affect different market segments. Who's going to win, who's going to lose. And that gets to the fourth implication that I think we want to apply or provide congestion relief toward the activities that provide the most benefits to Oregonians. But different people are going to be affected in different degrees. Different businesses will be affected in different degrees. For example, if you're a shopper or a retail business, you may be willing to tolerate higher levels of congestion than a business that is, a manufacturer. So we need to get beyond looking at vehicles on the roadway. We tend to have measures of congestion that are vehicle and roadway measures. And it's what is the level of service? If you build this project, what's the level of service? Or what's the VC ratio? If you build that project, what's the level of service or VC ratio? It's these vehicles out there. Well, that doesn't matter as much as the people in the vehicles and the cargo in the vehicles. So you want to know, if we do this project, who's being affected and by how much? And if you do this project, who's being affected and by how much? And so it puts a greater demand on the transportation analysts to be able to figure that sort of thing out. And so what we need in conjunction with this are tools, both an understanding that this is important to do, plus tools to help us do that. So we need things like our travel demand models to be use them so that we're looking at market segments. We need to have integrated models that integrate the economic transportation and land use modeling together so that you can also see how different parts of the economy and different groups of people are affected. All of this is included in this report that has recently been published on our website, and I've got my email address there and also the address of that report. So if you want to pull it down from the internet, feel free, and I'd like to hear from you. Any comments? Lynn?
Brian, I know that the OTP, the Oregon Transportation Plan, is under review for updating right now. What would some of the things that you could apply market segmentation to now to look at what policies would affect what segments of the population at the state level? Because I know that TriMet has talked about this as well as, how are you affecting different markets?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things we'll be doing is using our first generation statewide model in looking at different policy options, and that divides the business sector into 12 markets, and then there are 3 household markets. And so we'll be looking at the relative effects. We did that as well when we did the modeling for the bridge initiative. And we looked at how different markets would be affected by weight limits on bridges. The OTP is now still in an early stage, and so the various policy groups are going to figure out what are those issues that they want to hone in on. So I have no idea what those are going to be, and as those are made clearer, then we'll have to figure out, well, what kind of analysis can we do to address those. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're just in the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah.
Was this work you've been doing in response to that report that came from TTI, or have you been working on this prior to that?
I started prior to that. There's an earlier version on the web that was published in '98, and then I've just been plugging away on it for several years, and other things got in the way, and this sat, and finally got it done. But there's a big section on the TTI that is in response to questions that have come up with a recent release. Yeah.
I don't know if you can slide back to the slide where it shows the income and costs. But I just travel costs and travel. Yeah, that one.
That one?
Yeah, I was just curious how you came up with travel costs, and does that include the costs of sitting in congestion, or is that just like owning a car and paying for the fuel, or the building the road, or?
It's the time cost plus the other operating costs like fuel.
How did you figure that time cost? Is there some sort of average?
I used basically, it was easy for me to do because the Texas Transportation Institute in their urban mobility study calculates the cost of delay. So I used that same formula, but I used time instead of delay. So for the documentation of that, just go to their website and you can see what goes into those costs. But it's basically the additional fuel you'll consume if you're sitting in congestion, as well as the time in congestion. Yeah. The delay? Well, it would be delay, and that's one of the reasons I think time is better measured than delay. Delay is the difference in time between what it takes at free flow speed versus at congested speed, so the additional travel time. But in order to do their study, TTI has to look at, use some averages for all urban areas. So the assumed free flow speed for all freeways is 60 miles an hour, and the assumed free flow speed for other major roads is 35 miles per hour. But you get some roads, say in a dense area, and people aren't going to travel at free flow at 35 because it's very uncomfortable. So I think there's an arbitrariness to the delay measures, whereas travel time, you're not comparing to kind of an arbitrary benchmark. Yeah.
So I know that congestion is the worst in the Portland area, but that's also the area of the state with the largest economy. So are there differences across the state where congestion is actually maybe more expensive than it is as the average versus being less expensive?
Yeah, I think that would be fascinating to look at, but we got to first deal with the problem with the data, and that's and in this report, if you look at it, I don't dig into much depth in the smaller places. Salem and Eugene are also reported on in the urban mobility study. But a real problem with those places is that through traffic becomes a bigger part of the traffic on the road system. In Portland, it's a fairly small part of it. And so if you're adding up those vehicles that are through to the ones that are within, you can get, for example, it looks worse in Salem than it does in Eugene. Well, Salem has, being in the Mid-Valley, has more of the through traffic. You have to figure out how to deal with that in order to get to those comparisons. But I think that would be fascinating. I believe it's very important not to look at small cities like large ones. You know, large ones have a lot of agglomeration there, and I think they can tolerate more congestion because they have this bigger market agglomeration. If you took a Salem or a Eugene and had high levels of congestion, well, they don't have the markets size to kind of counteract the congestion. So you have to be careful with the comparison between cities of different sizes. Yeah.
When you look at congestion costs and solutions, do you look at sort of system costs? You know, for example, adding lane miles is expensive over time because, you know, like it costs money to resurface it and costs money to maintain it. And as you add lane miles, it just breeds more lane miles, which kind of grows the system in an expensive way. Whereas as people move to other modes, it doesn't put those types of economic pressures on, and it doesn't lead to those longer-term costs, bike and ped, but also transit, tend to be that way. So when you're looking at these types of things and asking these questions, how does that type of question figure in?
Yeah, you're looking kind of at the life cycle cost. And I really don't have a good handle of that, and I don't think a lot of people do that. And it tends to be more of, say, what is the construction and operation costs and what benefits you get. I don't know, maybe Ken or Rob would have some thoughts on that, but I'm not aware that a lot of people look at the life cycle costs of different solutions and compare those. I think it's pretty new stuff there. Yeah.
If congestion is tied in with the economic growth, should municipalities be including maybe something about congestion and transportation with their economic growth strategies?
Well, I'm a big believer in comprehensive planning, and it seems to me that if you're doing your economic growth element of your comprehensive plan, you should connect it over to your transportation element. And it seems to me there's a lot of interesting things that could be done, the what-if scenarios with modeling, because you might be able to grow in a lot of different ways in a city, and why not look at 100 different scenarios for where the growth could occur and model them and see what the effects of those would all be on the network, because some areas you might grow an additional industrial center, or might be less costly because it's not on the other side of a bottleneck than other places. So it seems to me they should be looking at that. Yeah.
Do you know of any data on because you're talking about the chain tripping or whatever, how do you know if people are having to travel further between shopping trips, for example, because the businesses are less clustered than they used to be, or is that just my imagination?
I don't know if see, one of the problems with travel data is getting a consistent set of travel data over time. And there is the NPTS, the National Personal Transportation Survey, but they've had some some problems with consistency with that. So I can't point you to a data source to say this is what you should look at to see if that relationship is holding. Yeah.
Early in your talk, you mentioned, the effects of, I guess, the demographics. I'm not sure the right terminology. Change in who was working and who wasn't working. And I came to the conclusion that possibly a paranoia of not putting enough investment in the transportation system will, or result in a detrimental impact on our economy, may be over-exaggerated. Because, we're not going to see that gross change in vehicle miles traveled because we're not going to see so many more people in the population. Is that reasonable?
Well, there have been researchers who have said that it's not going to grow as much as it has grown in the past. And you can see from that one chart with the moving averages. That one there. You can see it's going down. So, and when I think about those changes, like female labor force participation rate has leveled off, maybe we don't have to worry. So it doesn't look, certainly from this, that we have to worry as much as we thought we did back in the early 90s.
Growth rate, though, so each year it's still growing in terms of the VMT per capita.
Right.
So it's not shrinking, it's growing, so that demand's going to continue to grow. It just doesn't seem to be growing at as fast a rate.
Right. Rob?
Maybe this is more of an observation, but I'll spit it out and you can react. But there are a couple things that businesses or firms typically experience with relation to congestion. And a lot of times the statements are made, general statements are made, we can't attract good workers because there's so much congestion. So there's sort of are we a vibrant urban area where we can attract good people and not force them to sit in traffic congestion? But then also there's the economic impacts on manufacturers and so on, firms that have to move products and strategies to reduce their total transportation costs might be different than strategies to reduce the travel time of their employees. Have you thought about how that could be communicated better to decision makers or the public, or?
Well, I think we need to be laying out facts about how congestion affects different businesses and differently. On the first thing about we can't attract workers to to jobs, in a way it sounds like the Yogi Berraism, nobody goes there anymore because it's too crowded, something like that. It went something like that. And I think people are, they buy a package of goods when they move to a community, and they're going to look at the package. So I guess if there are other things that attract them, even though it's more congested, then maybe they come. But it seems like I don't know what you can't give out any facts on those things, but it points out the need to understand different market segments and what's important to them. Yeah, Tara? Okay.
I was just wondering, you talk a lot about household travel, and there's also business and sort of movement of goods travel. That picture, I would assume, would be a little bit different in how it affects the economy. Do you have any thoughts on that related to what you talked about?
Well, this is about business travel for one part of business travel, and you can see, truck VMT consumption expenditures doubled, and truck VMT, of course, there are different time periods, but you had greater increase of truck VMT. So, and there's one example of stuff we're trucking now that we didn't before. I just want to bring this up in the. It used to be that people didn't drink their water out of bottles, and bottled water consumption went from 1.6 gallons per person per year in '76 to 17 gallons per person per year in 1999. So about a tenfold increase in bottled water consumption. So, if you add up all the pounds of, that's 18 million tons of water being transported in 1 million trucks on the nation's highways, shipping around this bottled water. We used to just drink it from the tap. But, so certainly the consumption side of it comes from the households driving consumption, which drives freight movements. 2/3 of our economy is personal, based on consumer consumption. Otherwise, I think then you're looking at maybe specific industries and what their needs are, and how it affects them.
Yeah, I guess it kind of gets to sort of congestion tolerance, and can we tolerate the same amount of congestion for household shopping as we do for goods movement, trying to get to an airport to get your FedEx flight out, say,
Right.
FedEx package out. So those are policy issues.
Yeah, and I think that's where we need to be able to get a better understanding of what's important to each sector. So when we do, our analysis of policies, we can get a, because you don't. Someone who's a shopper, I think, would tolerate pretty high levels of congestion, because a lot of times, or at least for some shopping, because they'll go there, they may be there for quite a while, so the trip is a smaller portion of the total, time, and certainly you look at where retail stores locate, they seem to be pretty tolerant of high levels of congestion. Yeah.
There's a case you said increasing the parking fee to reduce congestion, that case. You said we have to look at the market segment to identify who is the winner or the loser in the improving project. Is that easy to identify who is the exactly winner or loser? Because like you said, that guy who need to drop his kids in the daycare, he don't have any benefit on that project, but I think he still got some benefit by saving some travel time or something like that. So.
Yeah, and I don't think it's necessarily easy. I think we're, getting to the place with modeling to be more able to do that. You know, really to look at this, the effect on trip chaining, then you need really an activity, you know, a tour-based travel model, and you know, those we're not there as far as that being the standard, you know, model for analysis. But to put a plug for the second generation statewide model, it is a tour-based model. So there's lots of things, interesting things to be doing, you know, for projects and later on in careers. Yeah.
In your in your conclusions, it mentioned that that there was that personal choices had a bigger impact than, let's say, adding capacity to reducing congestion. And I'm wondering how much that related to, I mean, how much, you know, adding light rail and transit was impacted by that, because I'm assuming that would be one of the major choices people could use. It didn't appear light rail was built into this or mentioned very much in your
I didn't
study.
mention it in this presentation, but the report has something on that. It was interesting. This past year was the first time that urban mobility study tried to assess the effects of public transportation on congestion. So they looked at, you know, trips avoided on the system and what delays would have been with those trips versus without. And for the Portland area, the number they came up with is that the total, you know, if you compare the delay avoided to the total delay that occurred, the delay avoided was about a third of the total delay occurred. So, you know, that's quite a sizable chunk. But yeah, if you've got public transportation that's on, especially on a separated facility, so it's not interacting, then travelers do have a choice to, you know, another choice.
It's safe to say that the conclusion that, you know, supporting alternative transportation is penciling out because it allows people to make those choices?
Well, I haven't looked into it enough to say it's penciling out. You know, I'd say that it, you know, the evidence is there that it has helped. So, but penciling out, you know, it depends on how you know, what you are adding up and all. I don't know. Yeah.
I have a question about the data that you used. I think I read about the congestion report by Transportation Institute, the last year's one, in the newspaper, and I'm not sure I'm understanding this right, but what I read was that people in Seattle was not very happy about the past report, in which the Seattle was in one of the top congestion cities, and they insisted that the report should consider the congestion efforts, such as adding HRV lanes. Then, as a result, they changed the measure, and Seattle went down in the ranking. Is that true?
Well, it's true that that WashDOT dropped out of the study, and it's true that they said, and that was not it was the time before, as you said, and it's true that they faulted the study for not, at that previous study, for not including the effect of HOV lanes and ramp metering. It's not true that changed anything with how Texas Transportation Institute did their study. The study, it was part of the program goals, and Texas Transportation Institute was already working on including the effect of public transit, of HOV lanes, of ramp metering, and of other incident management, of other operational treatments. So that was occurring independent of whatever WashDOT was doing. So it wasn't changed in response to WashDOT. That was for a long time. I've been on the ODOT has helped fund this urban mobility study, and I've been on the committee, technical committee for it, and that's been a goal long ago. So it's been the goal to move that study to be more and more inclusive.
Let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.